Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Section 6 of our public policy course, where we're going to talk all about implementation. Once a policy has been passed by Congress, once it's been given a budget, now what? Well, there are two different kind of ways to look at policy implementation. There's top-down or bottom-up. Top-down looks generally at how agency heads higher up and the people at the top of organizations make decisions and kind of control their areas, and those high level kind of factors that generate policy and how they're implemented and how they're actually run. If we look from the bottom up, we want to look at the people kind of, on the ground, so to speak, the actual members of the government that are in the field doing the thing. This would be, say, postal workers or, the people who sign the checks for VA benefits and send those out, and, the thousands and thousands and thousands of people that are actually doing the job. So which one of those gives you a better idea of how policy is actually implemented and what's actually going on and how things are actually run? Well, it's kind of both, right? You hopefully, theoretically, they would be very kind of on the same page, so to speak. But in reality, you often get a much different perspective on how a certain policy is implemented if you look at the high-level decisions versus if you look at how things are actually done by the people actually doing the work. Now, one of the things we have to talk about before we get further into policy implementation is one of the kind of consequences of our federalist style of government, where we have, the national government, and then each of our 50 states has its own government, and then of course there's local and county governments as well. But very often the federal government will pass new policies, new rules, new requirements, new programs that the state governments or local governments are mandated to actually implement. Now, not always, but very often, these new policies, new programs, new things that these state and local governments are supposed to do or implement or start or create an organization or whatever, come with absolutely no money attached. What that means is state governments or local governments have to pay for these by themselves, even though they're required to do them per federal law. This is called an unfunded mandate. And these are obviously very sore subject, if you will, with state and local governments when they're told to do something and required to do something but not given any actual money to do it. That can be a big problem. Now, who is actually responsible for implementing policy? We're going to go through a big long list of kind of groups that are at least partly responsible for implementing federal policy. Probably the biggest, most influential group are the executive agencies, right? And this is everything from the Department of Justice to NASA to the United States Postal Service. The president themselves doesn't take much of an interest in the day-to-day work of how policy is implemented. Most of that the president leaves to the agencies themselves on how exactly to implement those policies that they've had a hand in creating, they've had a hand in budgeting for them, but now they're going to leave the actual implementation up to the respective organization that kind of gets the responsibility for that policy. The biggest way the president can affect this kind of policy implementation is by choosing the leaders of these agencies, right? The president gets to appoint, all the cabinet ministers, the heads of the major organizations, and we're going to talk more about this in a later part of this section. But them choosing who gets to run these agencies is probably the most hands-on they get in actually implementing policies the vast majority of the time. But it's the agency's job to take kind of vague laws and vague programs and policies that are passed by Congress and signed into law by the president and turn those into specific rules, right? So Congress might pass a new law that says that the EPA is responsible for ensuring air quality is good. And they might even have some standards for what they mean by good, under this many parts per billion of sulfur and stuff. It's up to the EPA to then create a rule that businesses and corporations and organizations and other air polluters have to follow in order to meet that goal set by Congress. So I might say, a coal power plant isn't allowed to reduce or isn't allowed to release more than X amount of sulfur per year based on this factor and that factor and et cetera, et cetera. So they have to take these kind of vague laws and turn them into very specific and enforceable rules and standards and regulations. Now, the legislature also has a role in implementing policy, right? The most direct way they can influence how policies are actually implemented is with the specificity of the language they use when they're writing those laws. The more specific they are with the law, the less discretion the agencies have when implementing them, right? So if they pass a law about sulfur in the air, they could just say, this law says that the EPA must reduce the amount of sulfur in the air. Or they can be more specific and say, we want it to be under 100 parts per billion, or we want it to be under 500, set some number, some limit. And the more specific they are, the less discretion that agency has in making those rules. So they can play a role in policy implementation that way. They can also play a role in policy implementation by holding hearings, either before a policy is implemented to discuss with the relevant agency what they want, or after it's implemented to kind of ask the agency why it wasn't implemented in the way they intended, or why it hasn't been successful, or why it has been successful, etc., etc. They can set deadlines. They can say, the EPA has to reach this air quality goal by 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or whatever. Obviously, funding limits, right? Either positive or negative. Like, you have to spend at least this amount of money accomplishing this goal. Or the opposite, and say that you're not allowed to spend more than X amount of dollars on this project, right? So if an agency either has to spend a certain amount of money or is only allowed to spend up to a certain amount of money, that is going to affect how and when and how fast and how widely any given policy is implemented. So on the last slide, we talked about how the president appoints the heads of agencies and departments and such. Well, the Senate obviously gets to approve or disapprove of those. Now, the vast majority of the president's picks get approved, but not always. There are occasionally the Senate will come down and say, no, we are not going to approve this person to head up this agency or this department or this group. And then there's the legislative veto. And this is kind of one of those very interesting, weird quirks of the U.S. government, where the legislative veto has been found to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but it's still used relatively often. And the legislative veto basically just says that, the agency is allowed to implement this policy in whatever way they see fit, but we get to say, no, you can't do it that way, right? So kind of, you can do what you want as long as we're happy. But if you do something we don't like, we're allowed to kind of stop you from doing that. And this is kind of a law-by-law thing, but even though it's been found unconstitutional, Congress has kind of continued to include this in many laws, and it's kind of one of those things where nobody has really stopped them, right? They have the power to do it as long as nobody says, hey, you can't do that, and nobody has kind of stood up to say, hey, you can't do that, so they just keep doing it. The courts are also responsible for a lot of policy implementation. The most obvious example here is criminal law. If Congress passes some law that says doing X is a crime, it's up to the courts to actually implement that and hold people accountable for violating that law. They also come into play with implementation when it comes to lawsuits. If the EPA does something that I think is illegal, I can sue them in federal court, and it's up to the court system to determine whether I am right or the EPA is right. They take a lot more kind of hands-on impact with policy implementation when it comes to things, and I just have a couple of examples here, like naturalization. If you move to this country and you want to become a citizen, that policy on how to become a citizen is controlled almost exclusively by the courts, and they get to determine whether you've done the right things, whether you meet the requirements. They control the process and the ceremony if you do eventually become a citizen. And then, of course, bankruptcy law, right? So the Congress has passed all kinds of laws about bankruptcy and how that works, whether it's personal or corporate. And that is all implemented by the courts directly. They get to run bankruptcy proceedings. And while criminal law might be the most obvious way that courts are responsible for actual implementation of policy, judicial review might be the most impactful, right? And that judicial review refers to that whole, the courts get to decide if something is constitutional or unconstitutional, whether it follows the law or violates the law, which is kind of the Supreme Court's essentially most important, impactful job. So their ability to take a new policy or a new rule and say, hey, the way you implemented that, that's unconstitutional, so you can't do that anymore. That's hugely impactful in how policies are implemented. Now, outside groups, i.e. non-governmental employees, non-governmental organizations, can also have a big impact on how policy is actually implemented. I have a few examples here. For instance, licensing boards. Right? We've talked in previous sections about how lawyers and doctors and nurses and even electricians and such have to be licensed by the states. And those licensing boards are usually run by non-governmental employees from that group, right? If you want to get a doctor's license, the licensing board is made up of, not necessarily government employees, but doctors. So they are able to have an impact on how policy about licensing and medical stuff is implemented kind of on the ground, right? A lot of organizations, a lot of agencies within the federal government also have advisory committees. And this is where they get some knowledgeable people in that area to get together and sit down and say, hey, here's what we think your agency should do. Here's what goals it should have. Here's what policies or how it should implement these different policies, right? So NASA has an advisory committee made up of some government agencies, like the head of it is the vice president, but also a lot of non-governmental employees who just experts in space and rockets and policy surrounding space exploration, and they get to advise NASA on here's how you should do this, and we think you should attempt to do this kind of thing. And then often community organizations are employed by the federal government to actually go out and implement policy. So maybe the government passes a law funding a new vaccination program. Well, there are already kind of private community organizations that are non-governmental that are out there giving vaccines. So why not just let them implement this increased vaccination policy for us? So we'll give you a bunch of money, and in exchange, you go out and administer all these vaccines. Even though you're not part of the government, we're going to give you this government money to go out and accomplish this goal that we want to accomplish. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break. Thank you so much for watching.